All right, now the biggest thing that you need to understand about most of the societies to the eastern edge of Asia, we're talking about China and Japan, is that they are really, really, really big on filial responsibility. All of their societal structures are built around that famous, triangle thing that other history professors here love so much. And those China and Japan, their cultures sort of evolved together, and then they at some point separated. And we're going to talk about how that separation forms of what happens in their relationship with the rest of the world when they separate. But the biggest thing you have to understand is the triangles. Oh my gosh, the triangles. Okay, because the way that the emperor sits at the top of his triangle and rules is the same way that the peasant family's father sits at the top of his family and rules. So you have a society that's made out of little triangles that build into a bigger triangle, and that filters down into every other decision that they make. One of the ways that this expresses itself is that when a conqueror comes in and takes over China, it filters down to all the other triangles. Okay, so if the authority to be emperor shifts into somebody else's hands, the nature of that emperor becomes what is the best kind of father, even in the lowest level like peasant village. The entire society shifts in China from one ideology to another when they shift. And that's because of the way that they feel about their emperor, the way that they feel about their rule. Let's talk about why that is, basically. Probably one of the biggest things that happened in the post-AD world in China that changed the way that people felt about authority was the introduction of Confucianism. Confucius was an academic who came in during the Han Dynasty, so like in 65 AD. And his whole his whole ideology was the fact that nature puts us in these triangles, and we have a responsibility to maintain the integrity of them. You owe your filial piety, your responsibility, your respect to the person who's at the top of your triangle, whoever that might be. You, as a young son, owe your respect to your father. You, as a daughter, owe your respect to your father. And your father owes his respect to the village elder. And the village elder owes his respect to the district authority. And that person owes their respect to the emperor. So everything is built along this line. If we maintain this shape, if we maintain this ideology, then our whole life, all the way from the complicated running of the government down to the individual family, will be better. So Confucius pushed this idea of filial responsibility. He pushed this idea of ancestral honor. Honor your ancestors because you are the product of everything that they have ever done. You are sitting at the end of a long road of different decisions that were made. So honor your ancestors, honor your father. Filial piety is super important. And what you do not wish done to yourself, do not do unto others. One of the things Confucius didn't mess with was creation myths. It doesn't matter where we come from. What matters is how we conduct ourselves in the now. So that Confucianism really reshapes the entire landscape of all of these warlord, tribal, at each other's throats leaders that are all over China, and creates instead an empire that is pretty solid. In about 65 AD, Buddhism was introduced into China from India. And I love talking about Buddhism, and I don't want to get off on talking about Buddhism because that's really a World Civ I conversation. But I will say that if you take this filial responsibility and you label on top of it a sense of individual responsibility for finding wholeness and peace, for ending the suffering of yourself and ending the suffering of others, what you end up with is a society that has the potential to be very nurturing. It's what you end up with the potential of. Common sense, filial responsibility, and the pursuit of individual self-growth and an end to the suffering of yourself and others. And the way that he did this was by introducing these four basic noble truths. Life is suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. If you want to stop suffering, you must eliminate desire. And you can do this by following an eightfold path. And here is the eightfold path. Right views, right intention, right speed, right intention. That's actually two things that are the same thing. I have a typo in my thing. Anyway, whatever it is, 8 things that you need to make right in your own life to make yourself the best person that you can possibly be, so that you can live a life that is not dictated by your desires, which makes you a better individual that fits inside that triangle. You with me so far? So Confucius had a massive influence on the way that the government was run, and Buddha had a massive influence on the way individual lives were run and individual beliefs were formed. So what we end up with is, across China, an idea of, okay, you're not allowed to bring up the fact that his hands look funny, okay? Because I don't want to go through this again. We went through this all last semester. His hands are fine. They're tucked inside cloaks, okay? There's a cloth. It's fabric. Cue Othello. No, okay. All right.
Old wounds, huh, Mindy?
Anyway, okay. We're not going to do this again. But so using these systems, the Confucianism and the Buddhism, the Han Dynasty united several tribes under one leader, under one kind of loose structure. And inside the system, Confucianism was imposed by the state, which of course it would be. You know, we want you to respect the authority that's been placed over you, and by the way, that's us. And then Buddhism was spread by traveling monks. So the Han Dynasty was a dynasty in which China started to actually coalesce together into a single, instead of a gazillion tiny tribal kingdoms, into a single empire. And the Han Dynasty lasted a good long time. It was eventually, I mean, we're talking about from about 500 AD to about 618, when a group of warlords, when a group of nobles rose up and overthrew the Han and took over. And again, these are World Civ I conversations, but the Tang Dynasty from 618 to 907 took what the Han Dynasty had built and basically took it over without changing it a whole lot. The only big difference was that they imposed what was called the imperial examination. Now, before, in order to rise in power in the Han Dynasty, you kind of had to be born into it. You kind of had to be born with authority and then pass that authority on to your children, and your children would then have that authority. The Tang Dynasty made it possible for people to rise from peasant to ruler if they passed examinations. So you could actually test into authority, which meant that they had more people who were competent rising up. Who does that sound like? Does that sound familiar?
Like the one we wrote the paper on. The Janissaries and...
Right, yeah, it sounds a little bit like the system that the Ottomans were putting in place too. Is it possible that there was a connection of ideas? Well, this is around the 700s or so that's the Islamic Golden Age, but the chances are that they just decided at some point that it makes sense to find out if you've got gifted, talented people in your peasantry and give them a way to rise. Because especially if you're trying to impose order on such a huge land mass, I mean, China is a great big land mass. So they create these taxing bureaucracies and they need people to run them. And nobles aren't always born smart. So you want people to rise who are able to keep track of all of these taxing because you want money to come into your government. So you find ways to allow smart individuals to rise up and become part of your taxing bureaucracy. It makes perfect sense, even if it's imposed separately from what was happening over in the Ottoman Empire. So it just makes sense at some point to start doing that. So they did. They lasted for almost 300 years. And then the Song Dynasty rose up. And this is, again, one of the things that you have to understand about China is that they believed in something called the mandate of heaven, which was that a ruler can only rule for as long as heaven wants them to rule. And you'll be able to tell when it's time for you to stop ruling by the fact that other warlords are able to overthrow you. If heaven didn't want that to happen, it wouldn't happen. So what happens throughout each of these dynasties is that nobles will gather armies and kind of take a run at the empire and see if they can defeat them. And when they don't, they go, oh, sorry, we were just checking, you know. And at some point, somebody manages to gather enough of a force to overrun them and actually unseat them and take them over. And then they're like, oh, I have the mandate of heaven now. And the rest of the Chinese empire goes, yes, you do. Congratulations. What's going to change under you? And accepts it, because that was supposed to be the clue. The noble who is able to overthrow the emperor has the mandate of heaven now. It's usually preceded by some other signs like famine or bad weather, or, you know, disease or something like that, that an emperor has lost the mandate of heaven, but the final sign is that somebody's able to overthrow them. So that happens several times throughout each of these dynasties, but then the empire stands strong. Eventually, a nobleman is going to be able to overthrow the emperor, which is what happened in the Song dynasty. So the Song dynasty, which was a little bit south of where the Han dynasty was, swept in, took over, a nobleman rose up and took over and overthrew the emperor. This was the first time that a standing army used gunpowder in China. And we talked about that a little bit last week. We talked about hurling gunpowder in small clay pots at each other. The Song dynasty introduced the idea of Neo-Confucianism, which basically wanted to get rid of all this Buddhist crap. No more of this. We're going to settle on the now. We're going to focus on all the right things that you do serve your present, not your future. So focus on good work ethic and all of those things, and get rid of the whole mysticism of Buddha and the seeking of nirvana and all of that. You need to really focus on what you're doing right now. You need to be the best at what you're doing in the present and serve your master as a result. And this is also the introduction of the beginning of porcelain, the technology that makes China incredibly valuable to Europe, actually, is that they find a way to refine the product porcelain. It really comes into big production during the Ming Dynasty. All right, in 1271, Genghis Khan attacks. So we're now caught up with where we kind of started on Tuesday, because now we've caught up with Genghis Khan. When Genghis Khan swept out of Mongolia and took over this entire area, he broke it into 4 pieces, and those pieces were ruled by basically his hand-picked commanders. And the commander that he put in charge of this area was Kublai Khan. So as a member of his family, Kublai Khan swept in, took over, and imposed Genghis Khan's rule on this area. And then when Genghis Khan died, he held on to control of it. And we call this the Yan dynasty. Yan. I shouldn't try to pronounce some of these things because I'm always going to get them wrong. But this dynasty imposed the rule of the Mongolians, but like the other places it got to, as soon as they took over, they began to sort of soak up like a sponge some of the local things. So unlike the 3 other places where Genghis Khan's forces took over, this dynasty did not actually become Islamic. It actually became Buddhist. The Kublai Khan was more fascinated by Buddhism than he was by anything that Islam had to teach. So his forces actually imposed a stronger ideology that was actually very similar to what was already there. The Yan dynasty held on for not quite 100 years, and then began to fall apart. But during that time, they established some military districts. They split up China into these districts. And I'm not going to make you learn any of this, and this is why. Because they distributed them into districts, and they were called a Lu, a Fu, and a Zhu. And sometimes a Lu was bigger than a Fu or a Zhu, and sometimes it governed them, but not always. There's no way I'm going to ask you to keep track of all of that, okay? They divided them into taxing districts that were based on, like, if I divided you into small groups and made you work on a group project, but you were still a part of my classroom and you had responsibilities to finish your group project, but you also had individual assignments that you had to do as well. But all of that was due to me, and I had to provide all of that to my dean in order to prove that I had made you work. It's kind of the same principle. You, as an individual, belong to the group, to the class, and to the college. And you have different sources of authority for each one of those, right? So it's kind of the same idea. They divided people up into districts and then further divided them. And then those districts had different authority depending on what they were asking of them, depending on what they were taxing them for. But it was a heavily imposed system. One of the things that they did also was create a new way of managing social classes so that the Mongols were in charge of almost everything. The invaders were in charge. Underneath them, but outranking all of the Chinese, were foreigners who worked with the Mongolians, like Islamic people from other Mongolian strongholds who came over to help impose discipline. They outranked all of the native Chinese in China during this dynasty. And then the Chinese themselves were divided into two classes. One of them was the northerners, who were former subjects of the Han and Song, and then the southerners, who were former members of the Song dynasty. So they divided up, and you are outranked based on where you came from. The southerners were outranked by everybody. So it was entirely possible for a slave from Africa who had been bought and then educated and who was entrusted, an entrusted slave from Africa, to outrank everybody in China during this time. You understand how that can happen? If a Mongolian purchased a slave and then educated him and brought him up and made him an entrusted advisor to him, that African slave could conceivably outrank everybody in China under this system. So, I covered that. Unlike the Mughal Empire and Mongolian incursion in China did not result in conversion to Islam because Kublai Khan favored Buddhism. So they got to kind of keep their foundational theology. The reason that this dynasty fell apart was, well, there were multiple reasons. There was famine and drought, which happens on a fairly regular basis in China, but it always seems to coincide with the fall of a dynasty. So they lost their mandate of heaven because there was famine and drought. Then there was a problem with the leadership in that because they didn't come in strong with changing, because Kublai Khan didn't impose Islamic ideology, they weren't Mongolian enough for the Mongolians. And because he was favored Buddhism, he wasn't quite Chinese enough for the Chinese. So the leaders that were appointed from the Mongolians were viewed as not Mongolian enough to be Mongolian and not Chinese enough to be Chinese. So they lost respect from both sides, which causes them to have power struggles with each other. If you have to constantly prove that you are worthy of the position of authority you're in, you're going to pick fights to do it. So struggles in the leadership. And then what that led to eventually was an uprising from the Song dynasty, who was tired of being ruled by Mongolians. That was called the Red Turban Rebellion, and they rose up and they kicked them out of power and took over as a new dynasty under that mandate of heaven. So you have it right there. You have the famine and the drought and the natural things that are occurring. You have the disintegration of leadership, and then you have a noble who's able to rise up and build an army that overthrows you. So you've definitely lost the mandate of heaven, which means that when the Song dynasty takes over, the Chinese people are like, okay, tag, you're it, I guess. You're in charge of us. So this new dynasty that was made out of people that were loyal to the Song dynasty is called the Ming dynasty. So you've had the Han, the Tang, the Yan, sorry. I really want that U to make a noise. Okay, so you have the Han, the Tang, the Song, the Yan, and the Ming dynasty so far. But we're talking about thousands of years of Chinese history. I mean, hundreds at least. Thousands, about 2,000 years of Chinese history so far. So the Ming dynasty is kind of where our World Civ 2 story starts, because this is where we start to see China in a dynastic form deciding to be part of the trading empires of the Mediterranean, like deciding we're definitely going to actually try to influence world events now, which is something that they hadn't really done before. They had been on the beginning of the Silk Road, and so they had sent products down the Silk Road and they had received products back. But there was never a dynasty that said, we're going to start interacting as a world power until the Ming dynasty. So that's kind of where we start. Part of it was because the Silk Road and the Mughal empires, the gunpowder empires, were aggressive about their trade. So they didn't just bring in new products, they also brought in new industries. One of them was agricultural. They brought in seeds. Now remember at the very beginning, we talked about how everything moves on a latitude across Asia. Have we talked about that in this class? I can't remember. Okay, everything moves on a latitude, and so it's possible to move livestock and agriculture across from one country to the next, from Asia to Europe, because they're all kind of in the same latitude. So when the Mughal empires develop new crops, they end up in China, and China is able to grow them. As a result, they have better food, which the food that they went down into the Indian subcontinent and found, and then brought back up as new crops. So they have better access to food, less possibility of famine, which means that they have a population boom. That population boom moves out of the country and into the urban centers of China, moves into the cities, which means that they are able to up their factory production. And when I say factory production, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. We're not at, what is it called?
Industrial.
Yeah, we're not at the Industrial Revolution yet. We're not at, what's the thing called when you have like everybody just puts one, say what? Yeah, but what is that type of?
Assembly line.
Assembly line, that's what it is. We're not at an assembly line thing, but we are at a place where we're gathering all of these people who make porcelain under the same roof, and that's what they do all day is make porcelain. You know, so we are at that point where we're producing more porcelain than we could possibly use because we intend to trade it out. So we do reach that point. The other thing that happens is they implement what's called the whip tax system. And you remember that under the Mongolians, they divided everybody up into these really complicated districts. So you owe a group project, and you owe your personal projects, and you owe a report to the dean, and all of these things. Well, under the whip tax system, and they call it that because of the gesture, it's a whip. They go to your land and they assess all the taxes you're going to owe for the whole year. And after they've assessed it, they say, pay it over the course of the year. By the end of the year, you will have deposited this much in silver to cover your taxes. So we're not going to tax your rice individually. We're not going to tax your livestock by requiring you to turn over a certain number of livestock. We're going to assess how much you owe, and you're going to find a way to come up with the silver to pay it over the course of the year. And as a result, silver pours into the central government of China, and China is able to use that silver to make purchases from Europe. Okay? How you as a peasant get silver is up to you to figure out. You're going to have to sell something to somebody who has silver. But ultimately, you will provide your taxes in silver to the government.
So is this where all the fine china come from?
This is the beginning of their, what we call China as a trade product. Yes, this is where all their fine porcelain comes from. So, a single bill payable throughout the year. I had a slide for that. Okay. And they take the coinage and they make it. This is actually an older coin, so I'm not really sure why I use this graphic, but they regulate the size of the silver. Silver has a definite coinage, so it's easy to keep track of. You owe this much. How you get it is your business, but you will get it by the end of the year. And as a result, China is able to trade in silver. Okay. So now that China is gathering its own products, now that it is producing using these urban populations, now that it's doing all this, it turns its attention outward. China wants to dominate trade in the Pacific. The Qing Dynasty wants to dominate Pacific trade. If you want to come in from Europe and trade, you're going to have to negotiate with China. That's the goal. Qing Dynasty wants to make that happen. So first of all, they impose Neo-Confucianism. No more of this Buddhist crap, where you can do that privately in your own home, but out loud and officially, everybody is Confucian from here on out. Common sense, filial piety, respect the structure, respect the ancestors, keep it simple. And they begin to build ships that are capable of actual sea voyages. You gotta remember, China, the way that it's built, has great big rivers that run through the middle of it, like the Yellow River. So most of their sea trade was based on river travel. And they did have ships that could navigate the ocean, but mostly around the coastlines. Now they're building ships that can actually go around the coast of Africa if they want to. You know, now they're building ships that can actually do ocean travel. And those ships are actually they're pretty impressive, and they're better than a lot of the things that Europe has at the moment. So that's exciting. They are trying to establish themselves as a trading empire that other countries have to answer to. So let's talk about Japan. We're going to leave China there as a country that has decided that they're going to be a world trading power. And we're going to set aside and see what happened in Japan. Japan had its own kind of spirituality. It had a form of animism called Shinto. And under Japanese spirituality, under Shinto, everything has a spirit. Everything from every rock to every, tree to every human to every mountain has a spirit. And making peace with those spirits and respecting those spirits is incredibly important to your day-to-day life. The spirit is called kami, K-A-M-I, kami. And that spirit can be defiled and can be purified. So purifying and defiling and then purifying a spirit, these are things that can happen in the course of a normal day. So it's important to you as a person to make sure your spirit stays undefiled. So ritual purification is a very big part of it. In the 500s, Buddhism makes its way, it makes the little jump across the water into Japan. And it folds very neatly into this idea of Shinto, because life is suffering. In order to get rid of suffering, you have to get rid of desire. Washing away that which you desire becomes part of purification. So it folds in very neatly. So what Japan ends up with is not Confucianism, it's Shinto Zen Buddhism. It's the idea of everything has a spirit and you don't want to offend the spirit. They still do have a very strong sense of filial piety that they got from China early, because in the very beginning, Japan was settled by Chinese people. So they brought with them a lot of what they already believed. But they have had the opportunity to develop sort of separately. Under this system, that's a funny picture. Sorry, it's from a video game, isn't it? Yeah, okay. Under this system, a series of warriors, a warrior system kind of develops. It's very much like feudal Europe. Knights in charge of areas that are peasants, that look up to knights for not just protection, but also for justice. And what you end up with is a triangle of a kind of a different kind. At the very top of the triangle, you have an emperor, you have the Japanese emperor. Sitting right next to him, you have his warlord. And his warlord commands the fealty, the loyalty of a lot of other warlords. And then those warlords command the loyalty of a lot of knights, of warriors. And in 1185, we have the rise of a new class of knight that dedicate their lives to a daimyo, that dedicate their lives to a warlord. And that category of knights is called a samurai. Knights who serve the daimyo. And one of the things that they do is that they impose this idea of filial loyalty and the idea of kami, of everything having a spirit, onto their swords. So the thing that they honor is the spirit of their swords. So Bushido is the way of the sword. And this filters down into every other part of their lives. Okay, so it's the way of the samurai warrior, which it's the life of devotion to a lord. It's you don't want to defile your sword by fighting on the wrong side, by being disloyal. You don't want to defile your sword by being greedy for things you don't need. All of these things. Your sword is basically an outward manifestation of your soul, and you don't want to defile your own spirit. So you don't want to defile the spirit of your sword. So the samurai code calls for extreme loyalty and to the clan and to the warlord, and devotion to the ancestors, and also recognizes that the things that would defile your sword are things you want to avoid. For example, cowardice. If you are cowardly in your spirit, then it defiles the spirit of your sword. So this is one of the reasons why it is honorable to die in battle and dishonorable to be taken prisoner. That's right. That was a great big shock to people who came up against the Japanese in World War I and World War II, to find out that they actually thought you were asking to be punished when you were taken as a POW. Surrender. The only reason somebody would allow themselves to be taken as a prisoner of war is because they suffered from cowardice, and the way to get rid of that was to purge it out of them by the way that they're treated in the POW camp. You treat your prisoners badly as a favor to them, so they have the opportunity to purify their own spirits. So is that how we treat POWs in America? Yeah. Right, because when somebody surrenders, it's like, okay, truce for a minute while we figure out what to do with you. We respect your desire for this fighting to end, and we will try to figure out what to do from here. But in Japan, when a person surrenders and asks to be taken prisoner, what they're basically saying is, I am not worthy to die on this battlefield, please purify me. And so they do, brutally. So when Japanese soldiers took American POWs found this out, because they had done what the honorable thing, which was to recognize that they could not defeat the Japanese forces and to surrender and call an end to the fighting, which was honorable to Americans. But what they had done was extremely dishonorable to the Japanese, who were like, why didn't you just let yourselves get killed? And okay, I guess we'll take you back and punish you, which is what you're asking for when you surrender. So this cultural divide, this is where it starts. And if you can't die in battle and surrender is shameful, of course, one of the alternatives is to allow yourself to be ritualistically killed. So that was a thing that Western forces thought was really weird. And the first real introduction of all of these ideologies came when Jesuits started to visit Japan. So the document that I had you read was a letter from Francis Xavier back to his own people about what he was finding when he ended up in Japan. I don't want to run out of time, so I don't want to get too much. I want you to read the document, but I want to give you some background on who exactly this guy is. A Jesuit, that means he was part of what was called the Society of Jesus, which was a part of the Catholic Church, but was an aggressive evangelistic missionary part of the Catholic Church. The monks of the Jesuit monks believed it was their responsibility to go into the darkest places and bring, knowledge of Christ to those places aggressively, like win the world for God kind of people. They believed that chiefly for this purpose, to strive especially for the defense of the propagation of the faith and for the progress of souls in Christian life of doctrine by means of public preaching, lectures, and any other ministration of the word of God. So they would go into these places with the intention of public preaching, and therefore bringing people to Christianity who were nowhere near it when they started. They didn't go to places where people had fallen out of faith. They didn't go to places where people had heard of it and rejected it. They went to places that had never heard of it. And that was kind of what they did. And you don't hear a lot about Jesuit missionaries being successful. It happens sometimes, but generally when they go into a place, they're followed by the military and then followed by the merchants, and so their original purpose kind of gets lost. What happened when Francis Xavier went over there, first of all, his goal was to go to India and China. That was his purpose. He went to India and China and tried to find, places where he could do his work. But while he was there, he met a man who had fled from Japan from a murder charge and then had agreed to serve as his interpreter. So while he was in China, he met a man who was running away from a murder charge in Japan and agreed to interpret so that he could go to Japan. And this became his new idea. Oh, I want to go see this new place. I want to go to Japan. And this guy who is fleeing from a charge of murder is going to be my ticket in. Can you spot the problem right off the bat?
Yeah, got a bad boy with it.
Yeah, I mean, he chose as his interpreter somebody that's probably going to be rejected by this, Shinto Buddhist Bushido society as his interpreter. So right off the bat, he's made a mistake. He was in Japan from 1547 to 1551. He always struggled with the language because it's not just enough to know what the words mean. You also have to know the context around them. He always struggled with explaining exactly who Christ was and what Christ wanted to this people who just had no parallel for exactly what he was talking about. And over time, people realized what he was there for. It took them a while to realize, oh, you want us to start worshiping this guy. Oh, dude, no. That's not going to happen. Is that what you're here for? To convince us to become Christians? Dude, no. No, okay. We just thought you were like telling stories. You want us to convert? Okay, no. And as a result, people were began to become aggressive with him and get out of here with all of that stuff. Just no, this is not going to happen. No, because when he tried to explain what they were talking about, and you read about this more in the letter, so please read the letter, you realize that they don't have a concept of judgment the way that the Christians do. They don't believe that there's judgment waiting for them at the end of their life where they will be weighed that way. They believe that there is a movement of the spirit, but they don't believe in, but now if you believe in Christ, now you've got a judgment. So you want us to join a religious movement in which we will be judged? No, thank you. You know, so right off the bat, he runs into this problem pretty much consistently. He never manages to really get his foothold. And as a matter of fact, people begin to get upset with him and begin reporting him to the authorities. So this is the very beginning of something that's going to happen a little bit later.
The beginning of Iceland.
It's the beginning of it, but it's not there yet. He's only there for a little while, and then he goes back and brings back with him stories of this island where people are just impenetrable, and we need to get in there with more missionaries. We need to really, really get in there with more people because, man, they need us so bad over there in Japan. At the same time as that is happening, something is happening within the warlords that's important, and that is that Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, I did it all in one breath, begin to rise. Now this is Nobunaga or just Oda. You can just, the first name is fine. Oda, because it's actually their last name. I don't know if you know, but anyway. Oda is a shogun who is, so he's a warlord who is in charge of this area here, this little tiny purple area. Do y'all see that? All right, he gathers forces and he invades with his second in command, who's Hideyoshi. He invades Kyoto, which is here. Okay, Kyoto is the capital of where the emperor lives, the emperor of Japan. And he invades, he takes over with his army, and as a result is able to take over this entire gray area here. It's at first it's Oda, and then it's Hideyoshi takes over for him. And they build this massive army, and then they impose their own structure on top of all of these areas. They begin to require that the shoguns of all these little areas either submit to them or be replaced by them. And they take over a massive area. Now, they haven't unseated the emperor. It's important to understand that. The emperor has not been overthrown during this. It's just that the emperor stands side by side with his warlord, and this warlord has come in and taken over and has also created a submission of all the other warlords. Okay, so the emperor hasn't been overthrown at this point. But the power base that they have allows them to take over most of the central Japanese islands. So all that's left to hold out are these red areas. These red areas are opposed to Hideyoshi. This is a powerful story in Japanese culture. The Hideyoshi cycle is a cycle of battle stories and war stories and mythic, legendary, epic stories of the Hideyoshi cycle. If you're interested in Japanese culture, you will not escape without learning about Toyotomi Hideyoshi. So from this power base, they decide to launch an attack on Korea and China. While we are, settled into this great big power base, let's do something with it, and let's create colonies in Korea and China. So Hideyoshi attacks China in 1592, or attacks Korea in 1592 with the intention of moving across the peninsula and into China. When he gets there, he is routed not by the Koreans, but by the Manchu Chinese, by the part of China that happens to be up close to Korea. And that family, that small group of people is the Manchu. Okay, so in 1592, he goes in, he manages to get all the way up to the top of the Korean peninsula and begin to attack over into China when he is routed by the Manchu and driven back south over Korea from 1592 to 1596. And this is a big part of the Hideyoshi cycle. It's a big part of all the epic battles that they have take place on the Korean peninsula. So what happens in China as a result of this is that the Manchu realize their own power. They realize that they are a people of power. So this is where this is kind of where the Song or the Ming Dynasty has most of its power base, is down here. The Manchu live here. They are the products of what's left of the Mongolians, but also what's left of the Northern Han Dynasty. And they are I don't know how to explain it. They're not urban people, they're country folk, but they're tough country folk. And when they realize what their own power is, they begin to unite under their own warlords, and they form their own dynasty, which then sweeps down and takes over the rest of China. So we defeated the Japanese, we're going to turn and get back our own country, is basically what happens here. The Manchurian Rebellion is something that happened to Britain. But yes, the rise of the Manchu is where that starts. The Manchu in China have a whole different system. So we're going to leave Japan for a second. We're just pause Japan. They went back. They're sitting under a great big shogunate who has all kinds of power, but couldn't take Korea. So we're going to pause that. We're going to come back over here and see what happens to Manchu. The Manchu becomes a new dynasty called the Qing Dynasty, Q-I-N-G, Qing. And the Qing Dynasty imposes a new system of taxing, which takes the old system of taxing and streamlines it a little bit so that more money pours into the government and less money pours into the people, and is enforced by the military. They begin to use the taxes to pay the military to gather the taxes to pay the military. Does that make sense? They take the districts that were already there, the districts that were created by the Mongolians and then taken over by the Song and then taken over by the Ming. They take those districts and they make them military districts. They put troops everywhere that they go. They split power between one branch of government that is military, the Manchu, and one branch of government that is academic, which is the Ming. So they maintain some of the leaders of authority from the Ming dynasty, but they're more like government officials and less like power bases themselves. Then, they impose a strict code of conduct to make sure that everybody is obeying these military districts. And one of the parts of that strict code of conduct is a haircut. This is called the Q-U-E-U-E, Q. And it is a long braid, and you grow it and you grow it and you grow it. And if it's ever cut off, and it's a ritual act of humiliation. You're brought out into the center of the square and your Q is cut off. And that's ritual humiliation. So you identify yourself as a willing participant of the Manchu or Qing dynasty by growing this haircut. Okay, so I want to make sure that you've got what's happened here in China. The Ming dynasty decided to become a world trading power. Then the Ming dynasty was taken over by the militaristic Manchu dynasty. Now this world trading power is going to have a military arm, okay? And that military arm is going to require strict obedience from the Chinese. So if you are a European power, what you're going to meet if you trade with the Chinese is a productive, urban, world trading power with naval power and a strong military. How do you feel as a European about that? Huh? Intimidated? Yes, okay. It's like, okay, all right. We need to get in on this ASAP. So what happens, and this is a cartoon that was drawn in Europe, what happens is that European countries begin trading with the Manchu and trying to make allies out of them pretty much ASAP. Yes, this is the influx of westernization into China. They begin trying to make deals and get audiences with the powerful, fat, prosperous Ming and Manchurian dynasty, the Qing dynasty, which is a combination of the Manchu and the Ming. So they try to make deals with the Qing dynasty. It's incredibly important that they form these alliances. So what you have here is a man who is obviously 1700s Europe kneeling at the feet of the fat and prosperous Qing dynastic authority, okay? So this is where China is at this point in their history. In Japan, the shogunate of Hideyoshi is defeated in battle. And the person that rises up beside him is actually the warlord of the emperor, who rises up to take over everything that Hideyoshi conquered in Japan. And that's Tokugawa, okay? Tokugawa forms a power base that basically kicks the emperor out. I mean, they kind of keep the emperor, but they kind of keep him in a box, locked away in a tower somewhere. They kind of keep him as a thing they bring out for family events and stuff. They don't actually have any respect for the emperor. Well, they brought it back for a little while, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the emperor has they still have the mandate of heaven even in Japan, so it's hard for an emperor to maintain. We'll talk about how the emperor came back, made his comeback. But Tokugawa was a shogun. He was a daimyo. He was a warlord. He was a warrior. He wasn't a part of the imperial royal family. But when he took over, he imposed his rule over the entire Japanese island. There was no place that Tokugawa did not conquer. There were very little holdouts. And one of the things that he did was form a coalition of warlords to do it. He gathered other warlords, and he officially had them all recognize him as the head of them. And then he locked that in by making it hereditary. So now his son is going to inherit the filial loyalty of all the other shoguns. Okay, he locked it in. So the Tokugawa family takes over all of Japan and then locks it in so that from generation to generation, they will be the ones in charge. So no more of this splitting up between all the other daimyos, no more of this splitting up between all the other shoguns. Everything is going to come under the authority of the point of that triangle, which is now Tokugawa, okay? When that happened, he moved, first of all, he moved the headquarters from Kyoto to Edo, which is going to become Tokyo later. So he restructured the entire rural world so that it was a completely different picture. He instituted a tent government, which made rural areas restructured so that they fed into urban areas. So everywhere that there's a rural area, somewhere in the middle of it is a city, and that city is where all the administration for the rural areas come from, and that city has a shogun who's been appointed by Tokugawa, so he has authority over them. So he built the triangle, the same triangle they had in China. He built it so that it affected everybody from the emperor all the way down to the lowest peasant was part of this structure. And then he did one more thing. He closed it. He closed Japan to trade with outer nations. Part of the reason he did this was because of the Jesuits. Part of the reason he did this was because he saw that, not he, they, at this point the shogunate is more than just one person, it's a family, but they saw that it was dangerous for Japan to trade with other nations. They would get splintered apart, there would be changes in leadership, it would just be messy. So the Edict of 1636, no Japanese ship nor any native of Japan shall presume to go out of the country. Whoever acts contrary to this shall die. And the ship with the crew and the goods aboard shall be sequestered until further orders. All persons who return from abroad shall be put to death. Whoever discovers a Christian priest shall have a reward of 400 to 500 sheets of silver for every Christian in proportion. All Portuguese and Spanish who propagate the doctrines of the Catholics or bear the scandalous name shall be imprisoned or the common jail of the town. The whole race of the Portuguese with their mothers, nurses, and whatever belongs to them shall be banished to Macau. Whoever presumes to bring a letter from abroad or to return after he's been banished shall die with his family. Also, whoever presumes to intercede with him shall be put to death. No nobleman nor any soldier shall be suffered to purchase anything from a foreigner. We'll talk about that, but it's very different from this. What they have now is the result of this, but it's very different from this. This was an absolute, Japan will only deal with Japan. Japan will only include Japan. The only people that we will exist with is ourselves. We will be isolated and we will be secluded. Okay, so what you have on one side is you have the Qing Dynasty that has grown into a world trading power and is inviting in Europeans to negotiate trade deals with them. And then on the other side, you have the Japanese, the Tokugawa, who are closing their borders down to everything and refusing to interact and actually putting people to death for breaking that seclusion. So, based on only what you know right now about the history of these two places right now, which one of them do you think was going the right way? Which one makes more sense? Becoming a world trading power and interacting with the European powers, or closing everything down and kicking everybody out?
Closing everything down and kicking everybody out.
Okay, why?
Disease purposes for one.
Say what?
Disease, like you said, spreading of diseases, sickness, illness, bringing from one culture to the next.
I guess we feel that pretty personally right now because we're dealing with that right now, that other cultures have diseases. Diseases are bad. Closing things is better. But taking into account that most of those diseases actually start, the ones that really have a powerful effect on like the Silk Road, actually start in the East, it's a good chance that whatever diseases make it into Europe, the Japanese have already had. Because it kind of starts that way and then moves west. So it's unlikely that Europe was ever going to bring a new disease to Japan. Europe is the place where diseases end up, not where they start. So it was unlikely that disease was ever going to be really a factor. So setting that aside, what other reasons make it better to close everything down than to open everything up?
European imperialism.
But we don't have imperial Europeans yet. No, we have European kingdoms that are trading. We don't have empires. Not really.
Opening is how you get opium in your community.
But we don't know that yet. We don't know that what's going to happen in the future. We don't know that what the Europeans are capable of. So based on what the Tokugawa did, they did that for reasons that really had to do with Christian missionaries more than anything else.
They kept their beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
They still have those beliefs.
Right, they wanted to solidify their beliefs, but is that worth being cut off from all the trade of the rest of the world? So you're going to see as we progress exactly, hopefully, I mean, I know some of you already know a lot about this, but you're going to see as we progress how devastating Westernization was to China.
Oh, God, yeah.
And then you're going to see how the isolation worked as pros and the cons of the isolation in Japan. And you'll be able to see, you know, kind of who it was that made the smart decision here. But what you have at this moment is Tokugawa closing all the borders and shutting down everything, and the Qing Dynasty enjoying the kneeling Europeans. Yeah, so we'll get into that a little bit. Actually, we probably won't get into this as much next week, a little bit next week, but we're going to leave them both there. Remember that you have an assignment to write about Francis Xavier's letter, and then your foundation paper is due on Sunday. And you can send it to me no later than Friday night, and I will mark it and get it back to you.
Friday night?
Yeah, if you send it, if you just email it to me, don't submit it to turn it in. But if you just email it to me, I'll mark it and give it back to you, and then you can submit the mark, you know, the fixed copy. But you don't have to do, these are the 30-point ones to do, those are the small ones. I definitely recommend you think about doing that for your big one. But if you just want to try this and just do it, I don't think, you know, you don't have to do it for this one. It's 30 points, so it's up to you if you want to get, it's really, really hard to get 30 points. It's really, really difficult to get less than 20. So, you know, just do your best. And if you really want to strive for that 30 points and you want to send me your rough draft so I can look at it before you turn it in, I'm cool with that. Any questions from our Zoom people? Look, our class is like standing up like we're done. That's funny. Okay. All right, any questions from y'all up on Zoom? Hold on, I want you to see this. Look at this. Look at this, these people are ready to leave. Okay, so any questions from Zoom? Any questions from the class? All right, y'all have a great weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday.